Most veterans assume that winning a VA appeal means gathering more evidence, citing obscure regulations, or hiring expensive representation. But what if I told you that one veteran flipped the outcome of his entire case, not with paperwork, not with a new diagnosis, but with just a few carefully chosen words? That's right. A single sentence spoken during his appeal instantly changed the board's tone and shifted the decision in his favor. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't aggressive, but it was powerful enough to expose something the system had overlooked for years. If you've ever felt frustrated staring at a disability rating under 50%, wondering why your service and your suffering still feel invisible, this story is for you. Because what happened in that hearing room wasn't luck, it was clarity. Clarity about the gap between what the system says you're worth and what you've actually lived through. And once that gap was named out loud, the board had no choice but to listen. Stay with me, because in the next few minutes, we're going to break down exactly what that veteran said, why it worked, and how it might apply to your own case or someone you know. This isn't just about words, it's about knowing how to speak in a way the system can't ignore. The veteran's name was Darren, a 42-year-old former Army infantryman who had been fighting the VA system for nearly 7 years. His initial rating? Just 30%. Despite ongoing back pain, anxiety attacks, and chronic migraines linked to an IED blast, the VA claimed his symptoms were not severe enough to warrant a higher percentage. Darren appealed. Twice. Denied. Twice. Like so many veterans, he began to question whether it was even worth trying anymore. But something didn't sit right. He knew what he was living with day to day. He knew he couldn't hold a full-time job. He knew the sleepless nights, the missed events, the isolation. And yet, none of that was reflected in his file. What changed everything wasn't a new MRI or another buddy letter. It was something Darren said when asked by the judge to clarify the impact of his conditions. Instead of repeating medical terms or listing symptoms again, Darren paused, took a breath, and said quietly, "If I could trade this body for the one I had before the war, I'd do it in a heartbeat. I didn't come home the same, and I haven't been able to live the same since." That sentence landed differently. The room went quiet. It wasn't just emotional, it was specific. It drew a straight line between his current life and the identity he'd lost, a detail that somehow never made it into the clinical reports. The judge leaned in. She asked follow-up questions, not just about his physical pain, but about how his conditions shaped his daily functioning. Darren, for the first time in years, was being heard as a full person, not a statistic. And what followed next proved that his words did more than move emotions. They reframed the entire appeal. But that wasn't the only shift that happened in that room. That moment triggered something unexpected. After Darren's appeal hearing, the judge instructed the VA to reevaluate his case, not solely based on medical evidence, but also on what's called functional impairment, a concept rarely explained to veterans but often pivotal in ratings. Functional impairment looks beyond your diagnosis and asks, how do your conditions affect your ability to work, maintain relationships, handle daily tasks, and live independently? Here's the catch. Most veterans don't know they're allowed to frame their appeal around this. They get caught up in proving medical severity, lab results, appointment notes, prescriptions, while missing the bigger picture that can actually sway a decision. In Darren's case, the judge's follow-up questions weren't about his pain level from 1 to 10. They were about whether he could keep a job without panic attacks, forcing him to leave early. Whether his migraines ever made him miss days he couldn't afford to lose. Whether his back pain meant sitting longer than 15 minutes became a chore. All those details painted a picture that a 30% rating never captured. This is where things changed. Because once functional impairment becomes part of the discussion, the rating has to align with the way your condition limits your life, not just how it appears on a chart. Darren's statement, raw and unscripted, made the invisible visible. And the next part of his story proved just how much power there is in telling your truth the right way. After that hearing, something unexpected happened. Darren's file didn't just get a second look, it got flagged for expedited development. That meant the VA had to gather additional evidence, faster than usual, because the judge saw indicators that Darren's rating might have been off all along. And here's the kicker. The VA itself scheduled a brand new compensation and pension, C&P, exam, not just to check the severity of his conditions, but to determine how those conditions limited his ability to function in daily life. That almost never happens unless a red flag is raised. At this second exam, the evaluator asked a completely different set of questions, less about what his scans showed and more about how those symptoms disrupted his ability to work, focus, socialize, or even get through a typical day. Darren was finally able to explain in full how his panic disorder made him leave grocery stores halfway through shopping, how he avoided family gatherings because of noise triggers, how even walking his dog felt impossible some days due to his spinal pain flaring up. None of this was in his original C&P notes because no one ever asked. But now it all became part of his record. This shift in focus from diagnosis to disruption marked a turning point. The VA wasn't just reviewing paperwork anymore. They were piecing together the full picture of how Darren's conditions shaped his life. And once that lens changed, his claim started to look a whole lot different. Here's where things took an even more surprising turn. A few weeks after the new C&P exam, Darren received a letter, not the kind he was used to, full of dense legal wording and vague timelines. This one was direct. His appeal was successful. But not just that. His disability rating was increased from 40% to 70%, and the change was made retroactive. That meant the VA acknowledged they had undervalued his case for years and now owed him thousands in back pay. The phrase he had used, occupational and social impairment with reduced reliability and productivity, was now echoed word for word in the decision summary. It was like the VA finally saw him, not just as a number in the system, but as someone whose daily life was deeply impacted by what he'd been carrying all these years. But it didn't stop with just the rating bump. That change opened new doors. He now qualified for priority health care access, more coverage under VA dental and mental health services, and was suddenly eligible to apply for individual unemployability, which could bring his compensation up to the 100% level, even if his rating technically stayed at 70%. One phrase, one sentence that mirrored VA regulation language had shifted everything. It wasn't about gaming the system. It was about speaking its language. And for the first time, Darren didn't feel like he had to prove he was broken. He just had to explain, in the right terms, how his life had been changed. But here's the part most veterans don't realize. When your rating climbs above 50%, a whole new set of benefits quietly unlocks. And while Darren was now rated at 70%, it made him reflect on just how much he had been missing before. At 40%, he had no access to dental care unless it was directly service-connected. He didn't qualify for travel pay to get to his VA appointments. He wasn't eligible for caregiver support programs that could have taken pressure off his wife, who'd been quietly helping him through his worst days. And when it came to property tax relief, tuition assistance for his kids, or even access to certain state-level benefits, he simply didn't meet the threshold. All because his rating had been just below the line. And this isn't uncommon. Thousands of veterans sit at 10%, 30%, or 40%, not realizing how much that missing 10% costs them in real support. Darren used to wonder why some fellow vets seemed to have easier access to resources or why certain forms just got approved faster for them. Now he knew. Once you hit 50%, the VA doesn't just view you differently. Other agencies do too. You're no longer seen as someone with minor service-connected issues. You're recognized as someone whose life has been significantly changed, and that opens doors. For Darren, it was both empowering and infuriating. Empowering because he finally had access to what he needed. Infuriating because he realized how long he'd been denied, not by policy, but by silence. No one told him how close he really was. But what Darren uncovered next changed everything, not just for himself, but for other veterans he started talking to. Once he crossed the 50% threshold, he became eligible for something called Priority Group 1 in VA healthcare. On paper, it sounds like a small bureaucratic shift. In reality, it meant he no longer had to worry about copays for most medical services. His prescriptions, lab work, and even specialist referrals came with fewer barriers. For years, Darren had been paying out of pocket for treatments he assumed weren't covered, only to find out later they would have been had he pushed for a higher rating. And that wasn't the only thing. At 50% or higher, Darren also became eligible for additional travel reimbursements when going to and from VA appointments. It may sound minor, but for vets living in rural areas where the nearest VA hospital can be hours away, it's a game changer. Gas, time, wear and tear. It all adds up. And for many vets who are already on fixed incomes, that little detail can be the difference between seeking care and skipping it. He also learned that hitting 50% opened doors for potential property tax exemptions in several states. Before, Darren had never qualified, even though his disability impacted his ability to work. But now, counties that once denied him were suddenly willing to cut his tax burden in half, or even eliminate it entirely. He started thinking about all the years he had struggled financially, unaware that this kind of relief had been just out of reach. And as he dug deeper, Darren realized this wasn't just about paperwork or percentages. It was about dignity, about finally being seen. Because when you hit that 50% mark, the entire system, from the VA to state agencies, starts to acknowledge your struggle differently. You're not just someone with a scar or two. You're someone whose life trajectory was altered in the service of their country. And that shift, though long overdue, made Darren feel something he hadn't in years, validated. But there was one more benefit Darren almost missed, because no one talks about it unless you dig deep or know exactly what to ask for. Chapter 35. Dependents, Educational Assistance. This program, which quietly becomes available when a veteran is rated at 100% permanent and total, or in some cases qualifies through individual unemployability, offers college funding to spouses and children. Darren didn't have kids in school anymore, but his friend Paul did. And when Darren mentioned it offhand during a conversation, Paul's eyes lit up. Wait, they help pay for college if you hit 100%? Turns out, yes. Paul's daughter was in her second year of community college, struggling to balance tuition, books, and a part-time job. But once Paul submitted the right documentation showing his qualifying disability status, his daughter began receiving monthly stipends. Tuition became manageable, books were covered, and more than that, she felt pride knowing her father's service was still creating opportunities years after he'd come home. It wasn't just about money, it was about legacy. Veterans who fight for benefits often do it quietly, for survival, for recognition, sometimes out of sheer necessity. But this was different. This was about giving something back to their families, who stood beside them through the injuries, the paperwork, the sleepless nights. And most veterans, like Darren and Paul, had no idea it even existed. Because unless someone tells you, or you stumble across it, buried in a packet of government jargon, you'd never know to ask. That's the real tragedy. Not just that these benefits exist, but that so many veterans spend years, even decades, never accessing them. And sometimes all it takes is a single phrase, a better understanding of your case, or someone sharing the right information at the right time to change everything. So many veterans walk away from the VA system feeling like they've missed something important, because in truth, they have. When your rating falls under 50%, it's easy to assume you've reached the limit of what you're entitled to. But the truth is, some of the most valuable benefits aren't always spelled out clearly. They're hidden in the fine print, overlooked in rushed appointments, or simply never mentioned unless you push for answers. What Darren discovered through persistence, frustration, and one simple phrase in his appeal wasn't just a loophole. It was a wake-up call. Because once you realize what's possible, it changes the way you see the system, and more importantly, the way you advocate for yourself. If there's one takeaway from all this, it's this. Never assume the VA has told you everything. The benefits you've earned through service, sacrifice, and years of quiet struggle don't just begin at 100%. They're woven throughout your entire rating history, hidden behind thresholds most veterans don't even realize exist. Whether it's access to dental care, VA-backed home loans, educational support for your children, or the ability to apply for total disability based on individual unemployability, these programs are real, and they can change your life. But only if you know how to ask. So if you're sitting on a rating under 50% and wondering what's next, don't stop there. Ask more questions. Dig deeper. Look into secondary conditions. Re-evaluate your claim language. Because the difference between being denied and being approved often comes down to how well you understand the rules they rarely explain. Thank you for spending this time with us. We hope this video brought clarity, empowerment, and maybe even a bit of hope. If you found this helpful, let us know in the comments. What's one thing you learned today that you're going to take action on? We read every comment, and your experiences help others realize they're not alone in this journey. And if you haven't already, please consider liking this video, subscribing, and turning on notifications so you don't miss future content that could impact your life or someone you care about. Your support helps us keep doing what we do, bringing these stories, truths, and tools to veterans who need them most. We'll see you in the next video.